When you hear the word javelin, what do you think? Well, if you're old enough, maybe you think of the AMC car that came out in the 1970s, American Motors Corporation. Or how about an Olympic sport? Are you into the idea of throwing a long spear down a field for competition? Or are you thinking maybe a Sheaffer Javelin from the 2001 through 2009 era? Sheaffer pens. I've got a bunch of Sheaffers. I've got a lot of vintage Sheaffers. I've got some newer Sheaffers. And when I started collecting fountain pens, I actually picked up a Sheaffer 100 as one of my very first of my collection. Probably the first dozen pens I ever had. So I ordered this one not too long ago, and it's shown up, and I've played with it, and I've tinkered with it some. This happens to be a Sheaffer Javelin. They did come in different colors since they ceased production about 10 years or so ago. The Sheaffer Javelin was meant to be an entry-level pen, albeit though $30 to $40 was their price point. And which is probably more than just an entry level. It's probably a next level pen at that point, depending upon how you look at things. But this one here says it is a Javelin 124. And this one obviously is silver. I've got other Sheaffer silver pens. The modern ones I've got all seem to be fairly similar in their overall appearance, not necessarily in their specific appearance. And it did come with two Sheaffer cartridges. Since this pen is probably over 10 years old and looked to have never been inked before when I got it, these cartridges have seen some evaporation, as you can tell. And I did not use them when I put ink into this particular pen. I did have a bunch of Sheaffer cartridges here on hand, but in addition to that, I did go ahead and instead robbed a Sheaffer converter out of another Sheaffer pen that I had and decided to use it here. Looking at it, you have what seems to be a typical late 1990s to 2000s Sheaffer style. This one having the square top for the cap, the Sheaffer white dot, which is fairly ubiquitous nowadays, and you've got a nice metal clip. Supposedly this was actually made of brass. This one covered in a silver coating. And you look at the cap, it says Sheaffer repeatedly all the way around. It does not tell you what model it is here. It just says Sheaffer, 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 all the way around. You got the metal body that does taper down to a round, nothing fancy finial there. So you got the flat top up top with a square, and you got the flat top or flat bottom down here with the circle. It is a slip cap pen. What I will tell you, it is a stiff slip. It takes a good pull to get that apart. But once you pull it off, pull off the cap, you've got, and you can see this particular pen has got ink still on that nib, and I have actually had to wipe off that nib quite a bit since I put ink on it, as you can tell. Wipe it off, and short order it'll have ink all over it once again, I guarantee it. So it's got a rubber grip here for its section. I don't know if you like rubber grips. Some people do, some people don't. And as I said, it is a cartridge converter style pen. And that is one that I robbed out of my Sheaffer 100, which is a Ferrari 100 that I have here in my drawer. And I went ahead and inked this sucker up with some Diamine Royal Purple. You've got the plastic threads here, and it looks like a plastic inset or insert into here is what it looks like. But I can't really tell, but it sure seems like it's a plastic insert into a brass body. So you would be possibly having plastic gripping plastic here when you go screwed on. Doesn't take a whole lot of turns to get to it. You've got the typical open, modern open nib on this, and you've got a big old thick, that's a fairly big honkin' feed there on this particular pen. So the step down is not too bad. It's a smaller section than I'm used to, but with it being a little rubberized and it not being hellacious here at the step down, it's not too terribly bad to be for comfort reason. So it's long enough for me to be able to hold it in my hand. You can use it capped. I mean, you can use it posted or unposted. I will tell you that it does back weight the pen significantly, because there is a good amount of weight in this fairly good size and hefty cap. So even though it adds some, I think, aesthetically to the pen, it does detract from it in that if you wanted to post your pens, you're probably not going to want to do so on this particular Sheaffer Javelin. It is a venerable pen. I mean, they've been around for a while. They've been good and reliable. This particular one has a fine nib to it. Not much on fine nibs. And when I got this one, I started to write with it. It was okay. It wrote perfectly well, but just a little bit on the scratchy side for me. So I went ahead and I did do some smoothing to this particular nib, and I was able to get it to feel a whole lot better when it writes. So I'll tell you what I'll do. Let me pull out a few other Sheaffers, maybe even a few other pens of different brands, so I can give you some comparison to other models so that you can get an idea. Alright, pulling out a few more pens to give you an idea of what the Sheaffer Javelin and how it compares and how it looks. Here is the Sheaffer Pop, and the Star Wars pens. I've got this particular one is the Yoda pen, and I wish I could tell you what species Yoda was. That way I could enjoy watching The Mandalorian, knowing what the species was of the child, instead of just calling it Baby Yoda, which is not correct. Looking back into the 60s or so, the Sheaffer PFM, to give you an idea of how it compares to an old PFM. Here is one. I really don't know what model of Sheaffer this is. I just found it one day, and it is a modern Sheaffer, probably from like the 1990s, 2000s. Don't know. I just don't know a model name on it, and there's no indication whatsoever. So I'll eventually find that out. Here is my Sheaffer 100, one of my first modern Sheaffers that I had purchased. And you can see that the Javelin is just a little bit bigger than it is. And let's move on to the Sheaffer Tyrannus, which I kind of like the Tyrannus. The last Tyrannus I had was silver, just like this one, but this one is a Sheaffer Tyrannus in black. And then, just so I can have a comparison, the Faber-Castell Loom. And for those of you who are more familiar with the Loom, you can see how it looks in size-wise compared to the Sheaffer Javelin. One of the first things you notice when you pick it up, there is a good amount of heft to this pen, and like I said earlier, most of the weight is going to be in the cap as opposed to in the barrel. So you pull it off, you get a good amount of effort to take off that cap. I'll set it aside, and you can see that I've got ink on the nib once again, even though I've wiped it off. But let's go ahead and put ink to paper, and let's see how it writes. Like I said, this is a fine nib on a Sheaffer Javelin. And much like the Javelin has a point to it, this one does have a fine point. It's almost hefty enough that I could take it and throw it like a javelin. It's okay. This was not smooth. I did check tine alignment when I first got it, and tine alignment looked pretty good. And this pen had never seen ink. It was new old stock when I picked it up. But I can tell you that I had to do smoothing. So now, as it is, and this is just spending a little bit of time on some micro mesh, and I didn't even whip out, the high grit sandpaper, but just a little bit on some micro mesh, and now it's actually pretty smooth. So I was impressed. Not being a lover of fine points, this one I can live with. I can really live with that now that I've actually just spent probably 30 seconds, 60 seconds working on that nib just to smooth it out, just a hair. So you're not going to get much. This is a fairly rigid nib. You're not going to get any line variation, but you're looking at an entry-level pen in theory, and you're looking at something that you just want to be able to pick up and write with, and for it to be reliable. And this one has been. Every time I've picked up this particular pen, and every time I've gone to write with it, I've had no issues. And it's not a fire hose by any stretch of the imagination as to how wet it is, but I will say it does, for a fine nib, it does put down a decent amount of ink, and it shows up fairly dark. Sometimes fine nibs will go really, really light. So let's see how well. Oh, that's horrible. That's like writing with a sewing needle right there if you do it in reverse. But this has worked thus far for me. No matter what direction I've been writing with, it's actually worked fairly well. So no flex, no real line variation out of it. Stiff nib, steel nib. Needed just a hair bit of smoothing, and it actually has turned out to be a decent writer. So you can still find these online, and they're not horribly expensive. Even though they're no longer in production, Sheaffer Javelins are actually still fairly reasonably priced, and you can probably find them easily enough just on eBay if you did a search. I did put into this, just so you'll know in case you're curious about this ink, this is a Diamine Royal Purple. I was feeling fairly whimsical when I decided to choose the ink. So it's not my favorite purple, but I like it. I like purple. Purple's actually probably my favorite color. And this one here, not the perfect shade of purple for me, but very likable though. So anyway, there you go. This is my latest modern Sheaffer that's in my collection. I love vintage Sheaffer. Sheaffer is probably my second favorite pen brand behind Waterman, especially when you look at the history of Sheaffers. And Sheaffer nowadays, being owned by, I believe, the AT Cross company, they're a little bit different in their approach to things. A once venerable name, a once awesome name, quite honestly, in pen manufacturing. They've gone a little on the mediocre side, in my opinion, but still some stuff that's fairly reliable. I like this better than the Sheaffer 100 that I showed you just a little earlier. That was one of my earlier additions into my collection, but for a modern Sheaffer, the Tyrannus, and this, the Javelin, not bad. If you're looking for a low-end modern pen, the Sheaffer Pop that I showed you, the Yoda pen, those aren't bad. I've got several of them, and just because I'm kind of a Star Wars guy, and if you looked around my office, you'd see Yodas, you'd see Stormtroopers, Darth Vader's all over my office. So I'm kind of a Star Wars guy. That's not bad. But in terms of being a little more stylish and something that you wouldn't mind using at work, probably a Javelin might do you fairly well. So not a bad consideration for your collection if you're looking for something that's going to be a reliable writer and good for business use.